Well, hey everybody, welcome back to the Leaders Village and to our monthly webinar. We are really excited to dive into this conversation today that I know many people in churches and church leaders care about a lot, and that is how to have a greater profile and a greater impact in global compassion. To do that, I brought along an expert on the subject, a very good friend of mine and our churches and the Leaders Villages, Compassion Canada's President and CEO, Allison Alley. Allison, welcome here.
Hey, Jeff. It's great to be home. Great to be with you today in this conversation.
You had no idea this room could be used for such a cool space, did you?
No idea.
No idea. Well, welcome back. It's great to see you. Especially post-pandemic. I don't know if we've seen each other during COVID.
We haven't. It's nice.
Good to connect. Before we dive into the subject at hand, if you could just give all of our viewers a little bit of kind of the history of who you are, how you're coming into this conversation, some of your personal journey, family life, all that good stuff.
Ooh, absolutely. Okay, so my name is Allison Alley, as you said, born and raised here in the city in St. Catharines. Went to Southridge Community Church through the majority of my adult life, went to youth group here in this church, grew up with many of the same people. And my husband and I were really, his name is Tommy, plugged in, engaged in this church for a long time until God called me to step into the CEO role at Compassion Canada. So we relocated to London, Ontario a few years ago, just in time for a pandemic and a new form of life there. We have two daughters. Ireland is 12, Scarlett is 10. And I have worked for Compassion. We may unpack some of that, but for about 10 years, but 2 years in the president and CEO role.
It's funny when you talk about, even your kids now post-COVID. I bet if we saw each other's kids, we wouldn't even recognize them.
No.
When you guys moved to London at first, they were just little girls.
Babies, it felt like. Yeah,
wild. That's funny. Do you want to tell any of the story of how you met your husband? Because it's really not fair to the rest of us.
Well, I was suffering for Jesus in Honolulu, Hawaii. Is that the part that you're talking about?
Yes.
You remember that?
Who meets their life partner in Hawaii?
It set the tone for the rest of our life and relationship. But truly, I mean, do you want me to unpack a tiny bit?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great story.
Okay. Yeah. So, post high school, I did that gap year kind of thing and went to Youth with a Mission. Our discipleship training school, as they called it, DTS, was based in Honolulu, Hawaii. So I was there, met him there, but did an outreach in Chiang Mai, Thailand. And it was a 6-month outreach there that God really used to shape my thinking, certainly opened my heart and my mind to this thing called global poverty, injustice, child poverty in particular, and to plant seeds in me as a young adult that would, come to fruition in ways I wasn't expecting, many, many years later.
Yeah. And so now, kind of different configurations among couples, but the two of you are really kindred spirits in this journey, not just to London, but then to Compassion. And I know you're both involved heavily in the ministry, not just for work, and it's been super inspiring to Becky and I. I know as couples we've been friends for a long time, so that's good stuff. I actually want to kind of drill in a little bit more into kind of our history, because our church's partnership with Compassion actually predates your leadership there.
Yeah.
And so originally, you've talked about where your personal kind of heart for compassion started to stir, while you're with YWAM and, experiencing this kind of missions trip. Back in that day, what did you understand a missionary to be? Or how did churches and the whole global missions thing work in your mind?
Yeah. I would articulate it now, and maybe even then, that a global missionary is a calling for the select few to go, right? To go somewhere different, to be, whether it's, short term or long term, but there's this going and leaving your local community. And it was selective. In some ways, it felt like a prestigious calling, and I remember seeking, God, are you calling me to that? Because that would be the pinnacle calling. But that selectiveness and going was a key part of it.
And what in your, and we can attribute this to Southridge, because this is kind of where we came from, what in your local church helped kind of foster or stimulate that mentality? Because I would have come from the exact same mentality. A global missionary was a person, a rare breed, with a special calling, of nebulous criteria. I could never understand what the actual criteria, other than people wanted to go overseas.
Honolulu, Hawaii.
Yeah,
right? I mean,
exactly.
like, yeah.
Who would raise funds, and all of a sudden they'd be serving Christ overseas.
Yeah.
So when you think about your church, how did the church kind of cultivate or nurture that mentality?
I mean, to me, the mindset was there because that's what I saw. I was going to say from the platform, but the point is I rarely saw it. It was rarely talked about. But when it was in the form of someone coming back, right, to bring the update, to bring the slideshow, right, kind of share what they've been doing, with a call to us, of course, to support them in prayer and support them financially. But it was kind of a rare dropping back into our local community to share updates and going back out. So that continued to kind of perpetuate that them, not me perspective, right?
And for church leaders who are taking this in, I'd want you to know that this was really our starting point as a local church. I think back to the early days of leading around here, even from a financial budget perspective.
Yeah.
Like we had, when I first started, literally $0 attributed or devoted to any form of local or global compassion, with the exception of this one offering a year on Thanksgiving Sunday, where we collected a second offering for our denominational global missions partners. And that was typically the Sunday where the person would come from overseas and they'd be back for a visit or on furlough or whatever. And they would give the talk and tell the stories and, show the slideshow in order to kind of prompt and motivate that special offering. We didn't even carry a budget line at the time. It was just a goal that we had in there. And that was really kind of the starting point of where we entered into this conversation. And so, I mean, your church background would have been similar to mine. And for church leaders listening, that's kind of where we started. But then we started to, I guess the language now is pivot. We started to kind of evolve, and we wanted more out of our church's global impact. And I'm just wondering, in your experience of our church back then, were you paying much attention to that back then? Did you have any idea of what we wanted as a church, what we were trying to change?
Yeah. Well, first of all, when you say pivot, we have this thing at Compassion Canada over the last 2 years that every time someone says pivot, we have to take a drink.
Of water?
Whatever it is in front of you. And we have these guests that come in and are like, what is happening? These staff are laughing and chugging their drinks. It is the most overused word, right, of the last couple years. And unprecedented. But the point remains. I remember at some point trying to lay, you obviously, and the pastoral staff, laying the framework for changing mindsets and understanding how I described a missionary, as you said. Yeah. And there must have been a sermon at one point where there was an articulation of the fact that, the Great Commission, when it says go and make disciples, the literal translation of that Greek word is as you are going. Yeah, right? In your going. And so there was this unpacking for us in recognizing that the calling is not for a select few, but it's a calling for us in our everyday, ordinary lives to steward all that we are and all that we have to God for His purposes, which we know is, compassion and justice and life transformation. Yeah. So there was this journey of reorienting our mindsets around what it means and recognizing that we are called to that, right?
Yeah. And I hope that you're hearing this right now, not from the now president and CEO of Compassion, but from a Garden Variety church member at the time. Yeah. Because for us, that was one of what I would say would have been the two kind of underlying areas of dissonance. One was just as disciplers, right, we believed that every follower of Jesus ought to have not only a compassion and justice expression in their lives, but one that extended globally. That every Christ follower was to be a global missionary in some way, whether they ever got on a plane or not. And it perplexed us as we stared at this global missions model with this select nebulous few that got funded to go and do this. Yeah. How to make that happen, how to actually embed global missions discipleship in the lives of every person, in every Allison, and every Tommy, in every family like yours. The other side then, which you may not have noticed as much, but was that sort of budgetary side of the financial stewardship of it all. And I remember in my context vividly having a coffee just down the street at a cafe with a donor who had recounted the last 2-year history of this family that they had supported. So I'm sure many of you have heard these kinds of stories, but they need to raise funds for 2 years, so they're raising $6-figure dollars for their family to go overseas, and they go overseas, and the first 6 months is just learning the language before they're doing anything, and then once they learn the language, they start to set up some homeschooling while one of them starts to get trained a little bit, and then eventually after the first year, then they start to kind of dabble in the missions organization or the missions work themselves while they're homeschooling, during the day, and maybe doing this part-time until that doesn't work out and they have a problem, and then they end up at some orphanage or some alternative ministry, and then they end up coming home.
Right.
And I know that's not every global missionary's story. And full disclosure, my sister is a global missionary. She runs a Bible school in Japan. So I'm not anti-global missions. I'm not anti-funding global missions. But I will say this. As a local church pastor, this nebulous calling on a select few people that somehow elicited the funds of people randomly, in many cases, in situations that I probably, as an employer here, I probably wouldn't have paid to do ministry full-time here. It's like, how are you getting paid to do ministry there? It just didn't make sense to me. And so that stewardship aspect of how we're investing a greater degree of dollars and what the return on those dollars is became the other value. And for us, we started on this journey of exploring what would optimize discipleship and what would optimize stewardship and whether there was a play to be made. And so when we started to get into that really became our underlying goal, is we felt like to optimize our global impact. I'm more mathematical, so this is kind of reducing it to the equation, but we were trying to optimize discipleship and optimize stewardship. When you hear that now, and now you can wear the president hat, when you hear that now, because you interact with churches and church leaders all across the country, where do you see church leaders stuck in those two dynamics? Is this a common thing that churches and church leaders wrestle with?
100%. Absolutely it is. And it's funny, what I do remember back in the day, Jeff, the language, at least to my recollection, was maximum impact and maximum involvement, right? So it very much was this stewardship mindset, accountability, how do we really ensure there is that return? And if we are all about discipleship of people, why are we not looking at the opportunity to collectively disciple our entire church community, as they engage in this work? And the answer is yes. A lot of pastors are wrestling through exactly that as we engage with them. And on the stewardship side, on the impact side is the way I would say it kind of right now for this conversation. We kind of live in this post-when helping hurts world right now, right? Where there has been, an awareness and an illumination to the drawbacks and setbacks of more traditional helping models. And that for those, people who haven't read it, these principles that in good intention desire to help people, you can do more harm than good. You can perpetuate things like paternalism or dependence. There's this big lofty like white savior complex thing, right? So a lot of pastors are going, okay, I understand that maybe what we've been doing isn't always working. It's not, it doesn't always have sound, biblical principles or development principles. But what then do we do with that? Where do we start? Exactly. Right? Yeah. There was also that kind of skills piece and going, okay, we have people who are there. So is it about reskilling? Is it about capacity or capabilities? And how do we do that if we're here, right? We don't necessarily have that in-house. On the involvement side, most definitely, there's this desire to say, in some ways, there's an entire generation who's looking at church leaders and going, we need to really care about not just our local neighbors, but our global neighbors. They have this global mindset, and they're really challenging pastors and church leaders to get involved and, to really rally their church that way. So it's an active conversation that a lot of pastors are having.
Yeah, and I'm just wondering, if you're taking this in as a staff or as a leadership team, you might even want to press pause and break into some discussion to just sort of debrief some of these questions. What is our global impact currently? What is our kind of philosophy or even our theology?
Yeah.
Is it maybe more of a white savior type of go overseas and do things that otherwise people locally could do? And really ask the hard questions about what is our impact? Mm-hmm. What is our stewardship? What is our discipleship of our own people? And are we cultivating a global missions component in the lives of our Garden Variety church members and members of our church family? So for us, that actually launched us into what was a 4-year investigative journey. And at the time, our outreach pastor, his name's Tim Arnold, he'll be our guest next month here at Leaders Village. He spent 4 years kind of with a team from Southridge doing investigation and research of all kinds of different models, approaches, and agencies that ultimately landed us on this partnership with Compassion. And so that's kind of the next phase, is I want to kind of detail for church leaders how this dynamic now has worked for the past probably decade or so. Obviously, it started, though, before, like I said, before you became president. So as you recall some of those kind of early steps for us to become partners with Compassion, first of all, on the discipleship side, because that's probably where it affected you first, what did you see happening? What did it mean to start partnering with Compassion on the discipleship side for our church?
Yeah, and maybe first I would just want to set the context for your viewers on what I experienced was a congruency of our now kind of local mission strategy with our global. And as I walked with our church, part of the disconnect that I felt in the kind of traditional global model is that we were advancing our thinking so much on our local engagement, right? And you probably talk about this somewhere else, but our local anchor causes were just a huge value for our church. And it was all about, you'll know the language more than me, but a fully devoted life with Christ,
That's
right?
Pretty good.
Is that pretty good?
That's pretty close.
I'm going by memory, right? But living out our faith in action and being the hands and feet and voice of Jesus in our local context. So high value on proximity, moving into the neighborhood and encouraging us as members to do the same. So that's why when you started envisioning us globally around what it means, there was this congruency that I started to feel. And when you started introducing us passively, by the way, there wasn't this active promotion of Compassion, right? It was this co-developing of a discipleship journey. And, as a leader, I'd go, the best change management journey, like decade-long change management journey that you led our church on. And it all started to feel integrated, right? And aligned with the ethos of the church.
Which that's a great point. And I would say to church leaders checking this out, if you scroll back a few months, our very first webinar was about operationalizing Compassion locally in your church, which you're right, does kind of set the context, because if you have no outward focus at all and then try to splash a global outward focus on your people, it probably isn't going to make a lot of sense, right? You're grooming and nurturing and cultivating this for years in your people, so they're living like missionaries in their home, and then kind of tacking on or incorporating a global perspective to that.
That's right.
Yeah. So you started to experience that covertly. Weren't sure what kind of negotiations had happened behind the scenes with Compassion. And as a participant, do you remember some of those early experiences?
I absolutely do. So there was, first of all, I remember when I talk about like a multi-year decade change management or discipleship path, there was a particular series called Affluenza, right? This is not what you're asking right now, but there was this loosening of the roots, really, that was, and this unsettling of the status quo and the kind of the Western way of life that had laid some really critical foundations in my life and the life of our church. And then you launched, co-created with Compassion, something called a Global Action Plan. And my husband, Tommy, and I were actually involved in the first, I don't know if you know that, Global
I do.
Action
You were
Plan.
the first graduates.
First graduates,
Yeah.
barely passed, but
Yeah.
you know.
I thought Tommy aced it. They were a little uncertain about
I
whether
pulled him
you...
down a whole
Yeah.
lot, but yeah, that was fall 2011. It was shortly after the birth of my second daughter, and that 6-month experience changed everything for us, everything. And in hindsight, I can look back and go, I can see how God had been working in my life, in our collective church life, many, many years before. But this Global Action Plan was an immersive, comprehensive experience in unpacking what I would call like the theological underpinnings of this global missionary thing, the practical realities of the needs of children and the poor around the world, wrestling with this thing called privilege and wealth and our consumption habits, and doing so in a small group of like everyday ordinary people. I honestly felt like the blinders were removed through that experience, and I was able to see my life, my wealth, my privilege, and therefore, I would say now, my stewardship responsibility in ways I never would have imagined.
Yeah, and if you're wondering sort of what actually happened when you talk about this teaching series on Sunday mornings, this affluenza series, it was simply a study of the book of Amos.
Right, yes.
So
yes.
we weren't just making this up. We weren't experts on the subject. We were just letting the scriptures speak for themselves at the time. And then flowing out of that, this global action plan, really, it was a short-term small group. And so driven really and supported by compassion. That's how it became immersive, was they were providing so much of the resourcing and the depth of it. And now, correct me if I'm wrong, but was it the Global Action Plan then that drove the initial sponsorship? Like, is that was one of the applications of the Global Action Plan?
Practical action step was to say yes to one child
Yeah.
and take one step.
Yeah.
And that's what we did. Sponsored a little boy named Jimmy from Ecuador.
And do you want to talk about the story? Because I know Tommy was part of a team. I think my brother was part of that team.
Oh, no way.
And I believe Drew was, who's behind the camera right now, and many others who were on this trip to Ecuador.
Yeah.
Talk about the opportunity for Tommy to meet Jimmy. And,
Oh my goodness. And so, I mean, really, I don't want to go, too far into the story more than what is needed, I guess I would say. But through this experience and this sponsoring of a child, we really felt like God was calling us, we would say now, kind of out of the boat, out of our comfort, our security, a life of going up and to the right, and was calling us to step out as global missionaries, but we didn't know what that looked like practically. So Tommy gets invited to go on this trip. Again, like, I'm home, 2 kids in the house, newborn, and when he's there, they surprise him one day, and he gets to meet our sponsored child, Jimmy. And first of all, he was a mess. If you know my husband, his heart is on his sleeve at the best of times. But
didn't go there knowing he was going to meet Jimmy.
Oh, no,
Yeah.
no
Yeah.
idea at all.
Yeah.
Right? He's just documenting and capturing, kind of leaving his heart behind and doing his work. But it rocked his world. And for him to see Compassion's church-driven, child-focused, Christ-centered, holistic child development approach, he came home and basically said, we were discerning at the time what was next. He said, it's compassion. I don't know what it is, but it's compassion.
So he's the reason that you abandoned us. Yeah, okay. I was always wondered who I was supposed to blame, but that's... So let's flip to the other side, because you're using some words now that were relevant, because in addition to the discipleship side, obviously we're trying to now develop our local church's stewardship globally as well. And at that time, a huge part of this, in addition to the child sponsorships that kind of grew out of the Global Action Plan, we started to adopt these survival programs.
Yes.
And we ended up adopting a number of them, but at first, I think Ecuador was probably the first. Now, are they still called CSPs?
Yeah, child survival programs.
Child survival programs. So we started to adopt these CSPs, and originally that was what Tommy was going down there to film, was the activity of these CSPs. Can you talk about what a CSP is and how it works?
Absolutely. So a child survival program is the most life-saving intervention and programmatic work that we do. So it basically supports a mother from pregnancy until their child is, early toddler, so 1, 2, 3 years old. And basically, I mean, so many of the things that you and I, or Becky, your wife, take for granted here would be health care and prenatal care and postnatal care. But that's just simply not accessible, not affordable, not reliable to moms around the world. So on any given day, 800 or so women die in childbirth or shortly after, and about 95% of those are in under-resourced areas. So it's just because they don't have resources that they should. You know, in relation to that also, for kids, the first 28 days are the most critical in the life of a child. And that's where millions of children do not survive every single year. And it's just because of the conditions they're born into. So our child survival program is all about a local church community who supports a mom who is pregnant with everything that she needs to be able to not just see this child born alive, but to set the tone and the foundation for them to flourish in childhood and in adulthood. And all of our programs are holistic. So of course we care for her spiritual well-being, her social well-being, connecting her to other moms, right? And all of the medical and practical care that she would need. Then when the child is born, we go to her home to continue to support her with nutrients and food and training and connection to other moms.
Yeah, for church leaders listening, this is the part that really started to blow me away, because at first, again, it's more of a confession, like Compassion was a child sponsorship agency.
Right.
That was kind of the front-facing ministry of Compassion, much like other child sponsorship agencies. I had no differentiation. But when I started to understand the dynamics of what actually happens in one of these CSPs, I've visited them since. I've seen them up close and in person. Like the intervention, the holistic care, the support both of the baby and the mom, and in that regard, the whole family, and the amount of that, or the degree of that, that's supported locally. That's really what blew me away, is the Compassion isn't the savior that comes in and does all this. Talk about that dynamic.
Oh, 100%. This is what made me fall in love with Compassion as well. And again, back to the local church member, what felt so congruent to me in light of our values as a church. And it is that we believe in local contextualization, in the need for proximity and stability and long-term relationship, the value of friendship. All those things are kind of bedrocks of Compassion's program. So we partner exclusively with local Indigenous churches, right? Churches that are there before Compassion, will be there long after us. Churches who have a vision for their local community, have capacity and infrastructure and resources, and who know, right? Like the names, the needs, the faces of their neighbors, and are embedded in those communities.
When you were still, I'll say, just a church member, so you weren't a Compassion employee, you weren't president, you're just lingering around here, and you see that a church like ours starts to get involved in supporting these CSPs. What gripped you initially, or when, Tom, you went to Ecuador and had that experience, like what was gripping you initially about the ministry of a CSP from the perspective of our church's stewardship?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I would say as a mom, like just the mere fact, right, that we're caring for other moms and other babies was just such a core part to me. But also it's the fact that, we're resourcing a local church who is there, who is kind of the hands and feet of Jesus, who is providing, as you said, holistic care, is accountable, and we may get to that, right? Like fiscally, financially accountable, and is reporting back on outcomes, right? So it's like ongoing reporting on how dollars are being used, how lives are being saved and transformed and developed, and reporting back in a way that, we don't just know and hear that progress is being made, but we're involved in it as a community here.
For me, on the stewardship side, I really appreciate you bringing some of the heart and some of the motherly perspective of God's maternal heart to the conversation, because it actually was more about the numbers for me at first. When I think about that more traditional missionary story, the temporary, the few years, the big dollars, the homeschooling, the learning the language, and all the money's invested into, and then would see, the 2 or 3 dozen families, mother-baby pairings that are supported just in one CSP, full-time, ongoing, long-term, sustainable, trajectory shaping, and realized how much one of those costs compared to the investment per year being made in your kind of typical missionary couple. I just started doing the math of the impact that the typical missionary couple in the typical white savior missionary model has compared to the impact of even one CSP. Never mind the number of CSPs you could buy or support for the same dollars.
100%. And there's so many reasons for that, right? Like the church is already there. They have the infrastructure, they have the resources, they know the local language. So all those things you talked about earlier, right? The time lag it takes to really understand the context that you're operating in a traditional model. All of those dollars and times and resources are saved with this model. And just practically your dollar goes so much further when you're giving direct to people who are already there and connected to the community.
So as a church leader, these two things are happening kind of at the same time. We're seeing God stir up the discipleship side, teaching series, partner with compassion, global action plan, off we go. We're seeing God help us grow on the stewardship side, return on investment. You talk about the accountability, the reporting, the impact that we're able to see these dollars have. And the bridge then, similar to your Tommy story, the bridge then became the link that sponsorship can have. Because at this point, since getting involved in these CSPs, the babies who then graduated from child survival became the prospective sponsor children that the graduates of our global action plan could sponsor. And so again, trying to remember back as a church member, when you started to see that happen, you started to see the wonder of these CSPs become part of our church's profile. You started to experience personally and as a family the impact of the global action plan, and then saw them bridge together with the sponsor tables that had the CSP grad kids. Like, talk about how that all came together.
Oh my goodness, yeah. I mean, that is such a remarkable part of this, and we talk about it, from the womb to the workforce. And so, how I think about it now is, Compassion's model is not just holistic, it's not just locally driven, it's not just long-term sustainable development, but it really does think about the life cycles and the seasons, right, of the people that they serve in their community. So to be able to have this beautiful kind of handoff from one season and phase of life to the other, both in the context of their local community, and then for us, right here in the church, to be able to be a part of that, kind of walking them through the seasons from one program to the other, and then get to engage in different ways, once they enter the child development and the child sponsorship program, was just so meaningful. And that's really where that discipleship of lives here, I find, really picks up.
Yeah, and it really started to us to make sense when, after 4 years, we were doing this research and investigation to try to figure out how to have a greater global compassion impact. And so again, for church leaders listening, to consider, what we're doing to maximize discipleship, what we're doing to maximize stewardship, and whether compassion can be a partner to help bridge those, to not only resource them independently, but then bridge them together through the gift of sponsorship. I guess the final question that I'd ask, and you've alluded to it already a few times, but for those of us leading local churches here in Canada, I know one of the huge core values of compassion is that they partner with local churches. Why is compassion, I'm local church centered for a reason, you could argue, because that's where I get my paycheck. But why is compassion so local church centered, knowing that you could do this in a variety of forms?
Yeah, it stems back for us. So first of all, we exist to release children from poverty in Jesus' name. And that in Jesus' name for us is the recognition, really from our beginnings, but it's been formed more over the decades, is recognizing what we're dealing with here. And what we're dealing with is the impact of brokenness in our world. We are dealing with individuals, you and I, Jeff, right, who are in a broken relationship with God and ourselves and others and the created world around us. And as you and I, broken people, we build broken systems and societies that perpetuate things like poverty and injustice. And as you know more than me, this is your shtick, right? But Jesus came to redeem and reconcile and restore all things, both things in heaven and things on earth, and called us to be ambassadors of that reconciliation in, to our point earlier, in our daily going. And so when you understand kind of the roots and foundations of this thing called poverty, which is not just an economic problem, it's not just a social problem, it is a multifaceted, spiritually rooted problem. And if Jesus then is the reconciling source in that, well, clearly the best way to join him in that is through his body and through his church. So, I mean, those are the foundations of why, but really practically as well. You know, if you're going to recognize that, and then if you're going to prioritize holistic child development, right? We recognize that we are all holistic beings. And it's not dissimilar. What you and I need to keep growing in it is our relationship with God and our social well-being, our mental well-being. It requires pastoral care. Practically, though, I'll just note as well, churches are there. Like, they are in some of the poorest communities around the world. They have infrastructure physically. They have resources practically to mobilize. They have leadership and vision and people. And so there's just a multitude of reasons practically as well that we partner with churches.
And I started there with the, like, practically, they have familiarity.
Yeah.
They have longevity. They're not going anywhere.
Right.
They have trust.
Yes.
So that's not establishing new relationships of impact. I mean, like you say, they're there. And I mean, in my mind, what's blown me away, especially watching it on the ground, not only in child sponsorship, which I've seen a number of times, but in the CSPs especially, is just the local church's capacity for multiplying ministry. Mm-hmm. That's what the church is. It's the multiplied hands and feet of Jesus. And so as a global missions agency, if you're trying to multiply your impact or multiply your capacity quickly, well, why not start with the multiplied hands and feet of Jesus? And to watch these communities. I mean, I visited a CSP a few years ago in Nicaragua, and essentially this local church had what was kind of the local church's equivalent to anchor causes. They had missional expressions, and one of the missional expressions was their CSP. And it was just like everything that we were believing about the role of the church as responsible to usher in the realities of the kingdom of God on earth in your part of the world as it is in heaven. They were as dead set committed to as we were here in the Niagara region.
That's it.
And it was like, okay, I get this now. I get why Compassion partners with the local church, because that's what the local church is, and that's how it works in multiplying capacity. It was really quite extraordinary. So, yeah, to me, I guess if I was to call a timeout again for leaders listening, like, to consider your global compassion impact and consider the model, the strategy, and potentially the partnerships that can help get you there to maximize your impact through maximizing discipleship and maximizing stewardship. We've experienced that with Compassion, and really this last move, Allison, is to kind of dive into kind of the real-time kind of thinking today of Compassion and where your ministry now is headed in trying to do those things better. So you can drop the church member hat. This is full
I always wear it,
This
Jeff.
is full-on president mode. Talk a little bit, though, before we get there, just about your transition, because you know, Tommy's having this moment. He's saying, I think that there's something in our future related to Compassion. Like, draw the line from there to president, because I'm sure some of us are probably wondering.
I'm still wondering, Jeff, how that happened, because it was really fast. But yeah, so he comes home. We really feel like God is calling us to connect with Compassion somehow. We assumed it would be some form of volunteer role. I was a financial advisor at the time, and I thought, okay, God's calling me to kind of sit on the bench from, you know, leadership positions and to serve in a volunteer capacity. And we just started, I would say it's a season of divine appointments, of, people handing us off to different individuals to discern together. and we found ourselves having coffee with someone who worked at Compassion. And God was basically calling Compassion Canada at the time to step out in new ways and to launch something that was called our advocacy ministry, that was basically to answer the question, what about the rest of them? So we serve, X million of children today, back then, but what about the rest? How else can we mobilize and resource the church, whether they partner with Compassion or not? And we had a similar kind of stirring of heart and language that we were wrestling with. And so it became evident to them quicker than it was to me that God was calling us to step into that organization more formally. It's a crazy story, actually probably a story for another time, but they interviewed both of us. I think they might have made a mistake in who they went with based on your affection for my husband. But they took a risk and hired me, and long story short, I launched this thing, and our organization was going through a succession process. And very similar to my entry into the organization, where I wasn't pursuing it. In fact, I said no at first and kind of closed that door. But God made it so clear that He was opening it, and I had to just humbly walk forward and trust Him. It was the same thing with the succession process. They kind of came to me and said, your name is coming up, would you discern with us? And so my husband and I, you and Becky, were part of our inner core, kind of discerning together, and God made it clear that He was calling me to step in. But I had been there for 8 years before I actually stepped into the role.
Yeah, which is, that's really the piece that I was trying to get out, was for people to realize that you weren't hired, from the marketplace to just become the president and CEO. Compassion actually did an internal promotion, which I love, because around here, so many of our staff and leaders are kind of in that Luke 19, faithful in the small things, promotes you to 10 cities or greater responsibility as your reward. Compassion honored that as well, and appointed one of their own who'd been there for 8 years into that role of president and CEO. Now, in stepping into that, which I remember back then was a very humbling and kind of fearful place for you, what were you hoping to do?
Yeah.
Why does a person become president or CEO of a national global compassion ministry?
Yeah. God had placed, first of all, it was an act of obedience. And, I'm still reminding myself that God equips those He calls. He doesn't call the equipped. I am the epitome of that story. But God really placed 3 things on my heart. And it's funny, even retelling this story with you today, it's no surprise where they came from, because they're so embedded in our church journey. But it was 3 things. It was every child, every Jesus follower, and here's the point, every life transformed. That God really, I was so excited, and still am, even more so today, to continue working towards a world where we maximize our reach and impact on kids. We keep growing and moving forward in closer proximity to the need to reach more and more kids. The urgency is there. And that we're a part of, in Canada, mobilizing, in non-traditional, non-direct ways, sometimes direct partnership, but mobilizing Jesus followers to join Him in living a life of local and global missions. And through the process, when you do that well, and we feel so privileged as an organization to really be a bridge between the resourced and under-resourced church. But when you do that well and you foster reciprocity, mutuality, relationships, then you can see lives transformed on both sides of the equation. And so that vision has been driving us as an organization the last few years.
You've been in that seat now for a few years. We'll talk about the pandemic in a minute, but
do we have to?
Well, maybe not. Tell me how you've enjoyed your first season in this first chair.
Yeah, I love it. Honestly, I love the organization more and more. The deeper I get into the global part of the enterprise and looking under the hood in different ways, we are who we say we are. I love this mission. I love our impact. Certainly my role, I find it stretching and challenging and faith-filled in all the right ways. So I'm really enjoying it. I mean, there's been a global pandemic. Thankfully, I am a learner, and so we've been laughing in our household that I wasted time and money on an MBA before a global pandemic, because everything changes and you learn, different things in real time. But it really has been a stretching, rewarding season.
Talking about the pandemic for a minute, I have to say, the the pandemic started with me in Compassion.
What do you
remember
mean?
when we were in Guatemala?
Oh, yes.
We flew to Guatemala, and when we landed at the hotel, we found out that day that Tom Hanks and his wife had tested positive for COVID, and the NBA had canceled their season. Like, that was actually when it hit North America.
Huge indicators.
And we were told then that night that our visit the next day was going to be canceled. We were there for our sponsor daughter's quinceañera. But then the local Compassion authorities had said, no, it's a go still, we're fine. And so we went and did that, and actually escaped Guatemala by 4 hours before they closed the border. We were like the last Compassion visit in the world, and that's how we started the pandemic, on a Compassion trip.
So I do remember, I remember texting.
Becky texting you.
Yeah, and going like, where are they? Are they out? Are they out?
What president strings do we need to pull in order to find out what's going on here? So
too funny.
Yeah, that was how we started the pandemic. How has it been? I mean, we've talked about it in context like this with regards to how local churches have been navigating things. Mm-hmm. How has the pandemic affected the ministry of Compassion?
Yeah. I mean, we know that this pandemic impacts every single person, no matter where you live or who you are, but it has undeniably disproportionately impacted the most vulnerable children and families. For I was going to say obvious reasons. That's unfair. It's not always evident, but access to resources and hand sanitation is not readily available. Social distancing is a luxury just not afforded to everyone when you live in crowded homes and multi-generational, homes and communities, right? So it is spreading so much more significantly, and the lack of access to healthcare and interventions and vaccinations, it's just not the same. So it's been unbelievably devastating and disruptive, and yet, the foundation of our model in being church-driven, locally driven, proved to be the greatest asset that we've had through this pandemic. Because guess what? Borders can shut down. It doesn't need you and I to fly there to help these kids and families. The local church is there, and they are adapting and I was going to say pivot, but I'm out of water, so I won't do that.
Yeah, you can.
So it's been amazing to see the church serve in different ways, in substantial ways through this pandemic.
It's funny, when we left Guatemala, I remember us thinking, like, this pandemic is affecting China and the UK and New York City, and now it's coming to Canada. But in rural Guatemala, where we had been visiting, we're like, there's no way that it's going to get here. And sure enough, in the course of our letter writing, we found out that our whole sponsor family and their extended family, that they all got COVID, and it kind of ripped through there to that. This really is a globally affecting pandemic. And so, to have people on the ground and not to be restricted by travel restrictions and whatever is really a blessing. Want to talk about now sort of the future of Compassion, knowing that even as a local church that's been invested in this partnership as deeply as we have been, I know we haven't leveraged all the ways that Compassion can support this maximizing of impact. So let's start on the discipleship side, both for a church like ours and for church leaders who are listening. Talk about the initiatives that you're offering these days, or even imagining offering, to help local churches disciple their people into a more fully devoted way of life with a compassion and justice component globally.
So as far as what's available today, we care a lot about discipleship, as you know, and as you're talking about here. So we have different discipleship resources that we've created for kids called Step Into My Shoes, for youth called True Story, for adults called Eyes to See. And these are kind of immersive experiences that people can go through individually or in a group to really wrestle with a lot of the things that we talked about. And frankly, I was part of developing all three of those in my former role, and they are deeply reflective of the journey and the tracks that we have built in this church. So you would see the framework in those. We have all kinds of YouVersion devotionals that people can access. We have sermons that we kind of create and package for people. We have speakers and musicians that can come in. All kinds of fundraising activities as well for youth groups who really want to get involved that way. But more than anything, I would say we have a great crew of relationship managers, many of them former pastors, some who are in the room next door making sure I don't mess this up, Jeff, who just want to build a relationship with pastors and to understand their vision and their heart, and to say, how can we come alongside and serve you in that vision and co-create something? Because that's what we did here at Southridge, right? Is we co-created something unique for our context. And so we want to rally around pastors.
Which is super important to understand. So, I mean, you've got some off-the-shelf resources that a local church can access. Certainly a bunch of supports to produce or design a Compassion Sunday. I know that's often a thing that you've seen churches really leverage, is just giving a Sunday morning large group convening attention to it. And lots of support you can provide there. But it really is the up-close and personal relational support of your relational ambassadors across the country that can help work with local church leaders and kind of navigate for their own context what the kind of pressing needs are, or the best way to disciple people in their own context. If a local church leader wanted to start exploring having that kind of impact, growing their people in this way, what would they do? Where would they go?
Yeah, they can check out our website, of course, at compassion.ca. On there, there's a Contact Us button that can get them connected to a relationship manager. But even on there, they can self-select, comb through some resources. We have a lot of kind of long-form blogs and storytelling that will really get them into the heart and understand the work that we do. So they can be as kind of passive and non-committal as they want in their journey, or they can work with us directly and we can talk to them. But I would really underscore, you talked about the multi-year journey of research and discernment that you guys went on. That is really the starting point, is to really unpack and process the different models of global missions and the different partnerships. We are one. Obviously, I think Compassion is an ideal choice for churches to partner with because of our church-focused model, but really taking the time to learn and research and invite people into that. And if we can be a sounding voice and a support in that process, we'd love to.
Yeah, in a translated way, do something, even if it's not compassion. Do something. Take a step forward, and don't settle for your existing status quo. Talk about the stewardship side, the impact, the ministry side. I know that we've certainly benefited from the experience, discipleship-wise, of sponsorship and compassion support in so many other ways. But then also on the CSP, the stewardship side, being able to invest in these financially and have an operating budget now with, I think we have 8 CSPs right now that we're invested in all around the globe, and one on every continent, and it's really become part of our local church's flavor. Do you want to talk, first of all, what's happening out there in the ministry of compassion on the ground globally? Obviously, just coming out or still in the pandemic to some degree. Are there any new initiatives? How are things like CSPs evolving? How's the work kind of globally evolving that churches can partner with and invest themselves in?
Yeah. Really good. And maybe I'll set some context. I neglected to do this earlier really quickly about what makes our program so efficient and effective, right? Because that's really what we're getting at with stewardship and impact.
The ROI,
Right? And so the fact that we are a global organization, so, read economies of scale in doing that. We have one global program arm that works with a national office in every single country. And what they do is bring all of the best practices and global research, and they bring together practitioners and theologians and thought leaders and business leaders, and are constantly looking at the changing world and realities and saying, what are the interventions, the development models, new learnings in discipleship. I'm a graduate of Fuller Theological Seminary, and we're working really closely with Fuller on spiritual formation research. How do we measure that in the life of a child and a family? So we bring all of that knowledge together. It is kind of owned in the national offices in the 25 countries that we work in. And then we create this might be a bit too technical, but we create these catalog of interventions related to the holistic well-being of those we serve, right? Spiritual interventions, social, physical, cognitive. And then we mobilize and work with our local church partners to first do asset mapping, right? So there's this thing called asset-based community development. Yeah. What are the assets? And the reason we did the same thing at Southridge, right? Yeah. What's already there? What are the needs? And then what are the best practices? Again, remember, globally informed best practices for them to best meet that need there. So we do that. Then we have this comprehensive monitoring, evaluation, research, and learning team in the international development world. It's called MERL. But they basically are constantly monitoring. How are those going? Are we seeing outcomes and impact? Are they statistically relevant? Again, even spiritual outcomes. It's remarkable. And reporting that back for adjustments and reporting it back to our donors and supporters. So just like a highly effective, never mind when you talk about the audit trail of dollars, right? It goes from Compassion Canada to our Global Ministry Center to Ecuador, right, to our national office, to the local church. And it says your Edgar, what's your?
Edgar and Johanna.
Edgar and Johanna.
Yeah.
It says their names.
Yeah.
It is withdrawn and it's their names on our log, and then used, and receipted back what it's used for, and then the related impact for it. So it's just like a really well-oiled machine, right?
Yeah, well, it certainly inspired us, both as a family and as a church. And to that end, I want to talk about now this bridge, because that really is where this all lands for a couple reasons. The discipleship and the stewardship ultimately being bridged through sponsorship because of relationship. Can you, just to get technical again, talk about the ways a sponsorship relationship can blossom beyond just cutting the check?
Yeah.
Because most people I talk to have no idea what a sponsorship can actually become.
Yeah. So what we say we do as an organization is empower relationships. This is what we do. We empower relationships. And so our desire is to see a Canadian like you and me deeply invested in the life and well-being of their sponsor child, for it to be a core part of their prayer life, right? For it to be a core part of their thought life, their family life, for them to be able to kind of write letters and send photos and interact in a personal, relational, intimate way. They can visit. I mean, you've talked about flying and visiting in person. It's not something everyone can and will do, but something that we encourage. We've been piloting through this season virtual visits and have remarkable stories of people meeting their sponsored kids over Zoom. And so that really deeply embedded in the life of your sponsor child. And for those people who have parents, I know that's been our story, right, is to see our kids discipled as they kind of see life through the lens of someone who is so different in many ways, language and socioeconomic status and culture, but so similar, right? This transferable principles of being a kid and figuring out this person called Jesus. And so the opportunity to bring those two worlds together. We talk a lot as an organization that mutuality is recognizing that we all have assets and we all have needs. And so we all have something to give to the other and we all have something to receive. And so we long for it to be this two-way relationship where assets and needs are kind of recognized on both sides, and we all are getting, closer to Jesus and closer to one another in the process.
And I hope people catch that vision that this child sponsorship is in no way intended to be out of sight, out of mind. No. Quite the opposite. And through letter writing, through additional funding, you can provide, people don't know this, you can provide birthday gifts, Christmas gifts, one-time family gifts,
community gifts, right, to the church.
To the church, to the community, to the center. And so you can support even just financially beyond just the basic child sponsorship. And then when you talk about these visits, to get technical again, Compassion facilitates this visit. This is facilitated through Compassion Canada and the domestic country where the child sponsor exists. So in our case, Compassion Guatemala, they broker this visit, and we'll do all of the logistics again to cultivate this relationship. It's really remarkable and helps bridge the on-the-ground sense of stewardship and the kind of global action plan in the classroom, taking the workshop, discipleship stuff. And at the end of the day, you've used this word already, but this is really the punchline that I think all of this kind of works toward. Because we can talk about discipleship, and we can talk about stewardship, and ultimately we can even talk about relationship. But then you get into the word transformation. And transformation through this reciprocity. That's really the finish line of all of this. Give us kind of the last couple minutes of what you see and just the wonder of the transforming power of Jesus through all of this.
Yeah. I mean, we have the privilege as an organization of having a front row seat, to the church at work around the world and the body of Christ at work around the world. And we hear stories every day of, kids in Canada who are giving up birthdays for other people, who, we have this funny one of this Amazon driver who was like, I'm earning more money than I ever thought through this global pandemic and sponsoring 10 kids. It's these everyday, ordinary people who are being invited into the work of God through his local church to see lives holistically changed and transformed. That is helping them kind of awaken their heart and mind to the church first and foremost, and to be kind of reimagined to what the church at work can look like as they hear stories from the field of what that, how that's playing out, and to recognize that God has entrusted them, right? Not just with financial resources, but with time and talent and influence, and that they have a responsibility and a privilege, right, to use and steward that on behalf of others. And as they do that, and as they're not just, as I said, passing resources back and forth, but engaging in relational ways. They're using their gifts here and gifts are being grown there. They are growing in the process. And so it really has been such a joy to us to see that transformation through so many different individuals in Canada, and certainly the millions of kids that we serve around the world.
I hope as church leaders who are taking this in, you're inspired by this, because I know our job in local church settings is to help form Jesus in people. We're in the transformation business. And this conversation about global compassion can often get pushed to the side because you think, oh, this is another add-on to the primary calling of discipling my people, to spiritually growing the people entrusted to my care. This is integral. This is essential to the discipleship and the transformational work of Jesus in the people entrusted to your care. And so I just want to kind of leave us with that mandate that if you are in the transformation business, you cannot escape a global missions component in your people. Ask those hard questions about how you're maximizing discipleship, maximizing stewardship, and maximizing your impact, because they will maximize relationship and ultimately transformation, whether it's compassion or not, although I certainly would lean in that direction. As we wrap up, if someone wanted to follow up with you or follow you on social media, where would they find you?
Yeah, you can find me at Allison Alley, Alley, on most social channels, or you can find my contact information on our website.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for being here today.
My pleasure.
And helping us serve churches across our country and beyond. I am excited for our next era of partnership and for continuing to grow together as friends and couples. We love you guys and are really grateful that you spent some time with us today.
Thanks, sir.
Thanks to all of you for joining us again this month. Next month, we're going to stare in the face the polarization of the world that we find ourselves in and try to learn how to manage that polarity better through...
The power of and. Did I get it?
Leading with and.
Oh, leading with and. Oh.
Our mutual good friend Tim Arnold is going to join us next month as we're going to learn how to manage polarity better in the context of our local churches and communities. So we're excited about that. Hope to see you there. Take care, everybody. We're glad that you joined us in finding our way together. We'll see you next month.